Steve Simon is a diplomat and policymaker. He previously served as a senior director for Middle Eastern and North African affairs at the White House, advising President Obama during a most difficult period in U.S.-Israeli relations with the tumultuous changes of the Arab Spring. I met Steve, first of all, when he was a star at the State Department. He preceded me as executive director of the Washington office of IISS, and he's currently a visiting lecturer at Dartmouth College. He and Dana previously co-authored The Sixth Crisis, Iran, Israel, America, and the Rumors of War. When that war didn't break out, they had to write their current book. This event will run for an hour. Following remarks by the co-authors, we'll have a interaction with the audience, and that audience includes people who are watching live on the website. If anybody watching live wants to submit a question, try to do so by responding to one of my tweets. And if you see me fiddling with my iPhone, it's not because I'm bored, it's because I'm trying to live tweet some of their remarks. After the event, copies of the book will be available for purchase at a special discounted rate at the reception desk.
This was a difficult subject, and I think because we took the difficulty seriously, we've written a pretty good book. By difficult, I don't mean, or at least I don't only mean, that the subject is controversial and acrimonious, although of course it is both. But it's difficult mainly because the topic required a serious expression of how the two states and societies have mirrored each other across many dimensions: strategic, moral, political, cultural, and of course religious. And to capture as clearly as possible all these and other dimensions of the mirror imaging, as we call it, is necessary to explain why we believe and fear that the mirrors are breaking. The book, to this end, contains two very substantial historical chapters. At the beginning, it was useful, I think, that the book was co-authored by an American Jew and an American Gentile, both of a certain age and a certain generation. And I'm going to return in a few moments to the significance of our generation and its foreseeable, if not imminent, exit from the stage. The Jewish-Gentile combination is important because the Jewish experience is obviously central to this issue. But at the same time, America's long and visceral support for Israel cannot be understood as Jewish support. It's broader and more deeply reflective of American traditions and purposes. It's also useful that one of us had a long career in government that brought him into frequent interaction with Israel and collaboration with Israel and Israelis. Just to summarize briefly, I mean, Mark's already mentioned it, but Steve's first foreign posting was to the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, and he was there during the Lebanon War. Also during the Reagan administration, Steve staffed the Joint Political Military Group that gave operational substance to the strategic relationship. He worked closely with Israelis on counterterrorism in the Clinton White House, and of course his responsibilities on President Obama's national security staff included the Israel relationship at a time when it came under significant strain. So Steve's experience imparts valuable insight that's reflected in the historic chapters that I just mentioned, but also the four chunky chapters in the middle that cover the crisis years of Obama and Netanyahu, dealing in depth with disputes over Israeli settlements, the peace process, how to react to the Arab convulsions that followed the Arab Spring, and whether to negotiate with or bomb Iran because of its nuclear program. But I do want to make one thing clear. Though it is in part an insider account, but this book does not belong to the genre of insider sort of TikToks or personality-focused psychodrama. Now, there obviously was a personality clash between Obama and Netanyahu, and there have been good and some not so good efforts to examine the personalities involved for clues to the problem. Among the less illuminating, in my view, was the book by a recent Israeli ambassador who found psychoanalytical clues in President Obama's unfulfilled relations with his Muslim-born father, and his Muslim stepfather. The ambassador's book also suggested that American Jews criticize Israel in order to secure their status in WASP society. And in this regard, he even had something to say about the depth of my co-author's attachment to Judaism. There are better examples of this genre, much better examples of this genre, including some particularly good reporting in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and other publications. But what the personality-focused accounts always tend to obscure is that there are significant substantive disputes between the United States and Israel. Let's start with the first one I mentioned, Israeli settlements. As a reminder, here's what the president said to Israel's prime minister. I'll quote, "The United States will not support the use of any additional land for the purpose of settlements. Indeed, the immediate adoption of a settlement freeze by Israel, more than any other action, could create the confidence needed for wider participation in these talks. Further settlement activity is in no way necessary for the security of Israel and only diminishes the confidence of the Arabs that a final outcome can be freely and fairly negotiated." Okay, you're familiar with this argument, except it's worth noting that the president in this case was Ronald Reagan. I think I heard somebody whisper that. And the prime minister was Menachem Begin, who at the time said that Reagan's words had occasioned the saddest day of my life. So what does the continuity of American complaint tell us? We need to think carefully about this question. Obviously, some will say that it proves that basically there's nothing to worry about. Every president since Harry Truman has complained about aspects of Israel's behavior, but there is much more to keep us together and the relationship endures. We believe, and it's a central thesis of our book, that this is dangerous complacency. First of all, the passage of time matters. As Herb Stein once said, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Reagan delivered that speech 15 years after the June 1967 war that started the occupation. It's now been 50 years. After 50 years, the likelihood of a peace settlement ending in a two-state solution, ending the occupation regime, looks pretty small. Now, we can say for discussion the question of whether the U.S. can simply accept the demise of a two-state solution and accept that the Palestinians would never have full democratic rights on the land that they now inhabit. But I would only observe that Hillary Clinton, who is really and undoubtedly fiercely pro-Israeli, published an article in the Forward last fall about her commitment to Israel. The title included the words "unbreakable bond." It's worth noting that her first agenda item in that article was about restarting the peace process and getting to a two-state solution. That's not the agenda of someone who's planning or ready to acquiesce in a creeping annexation of the West Bank. Second, the tolerance of the Reagan administration really rested, and subsequent administrations, has rested on a rounded, deep, and cross-dimensional relationship of values, culture, religion, strategic interest, as I noted above. We are about to run a very dangerous natural experiment to see what happens when some of these dimensions are removed. It's been stated many times, but it's worth restating. It is not Ronald Reagan's America anymore. The country is becoming more diverse, and the country's youth is becoming less religious. We can argue about whether the country is becoming more liberal. I think the evidence for this is strong, and we present some of that evidence in our book. It is nearly impossible, however, to argue against the proposition that the Democratic Party is moving to the left. And we already see how Israel has become a partisan issue in America in a way that it really wasn't before. I think Steve's going to talk a bit more about the Israeli side of the equation. But if I were an Israeli, I'd be really worried about tying the cords more exclusively to a Republican Party that is currently, by definition, the party of Trump. Now, if you wind back from Trump a little bit and you look at the foreign policy ideas of his primary competitors, you have some ideas that are congruent with current Israeli government policies, if not deep Israeli interests, I suppose. There was a lot of talk, in fact, the most I think we heard from non-Trump candidates was about Obama's lack of moral clarity because he refrained from saying the words Islamist terrorism or Islamist extremism. There was a lot of criticism of his agreeing to a nuclear deal that effectively accepts the idea and the reality of an Iranian enrichment program. I mean, it's also true that the House is probably pretty likely to remain in Republican hands. There's going to be probably a strong minority, if not a majority, of Republican senators. And Israel has strongly cultivated its relations with Congress, and these will continue. But I think maybe we can talk in the discussion about how much of a bedrock or a ballast that gives to the relationship. The most fundamental problem is this, and this is what I talked about with my chilling reference to the generation I represent. This is the and Steve and I both belong to this generation. It's the post-war generation upon which World War II, the enormity of the Holocaust, the rightness of Israel's cause in its early wars, including the Six-Day War, all of these things are imprinted in our memory and our consciousness. What I was trying to say is we don't have that much time left. A woman 11 years older than us is very likely to become the next president, or 10 years older than me, maybe. But you can count pretty easily the number of years that our generation will still be running in things. And in these terms, a political window is closing. The new generation is the Sanders generation. Obviously not 74-year-old Bernie Sanders, but his followers. And polls show pretty clearly that they're less pro-Israeli and more concerned about the Palestinians than their parents. This applies to Sanders' Jewish young followers as well, of course. Now, the exact mechanism by which this generational and political shift changes U.S. policy is not clear, and I'm not going to pretend to say how that's going to happen. And you can always, in research and discussions for this book, many people brought up something obvious, that with the issue of U.S.-Israeli relations, and particularly American complaints about settlements or the West Bank or the peace process, you can always point to an asymmetry of interest. I mean, strong supporters of Israeli policy are more focused than the broader, let's say, critics. I referred to demographic changes in the United States, but I don't have any particular evidence that the growing Hispanic population is going to be voting on, is going to be making political preferences, or at least going into the ballot box and making decisions based on the Israel issue. But I would say this: if you look at this year's Republican nominating process, culminating in Donald Trump, it's just stunning evidence that change, when it comes quickly and unexpectedly. And that's one reason why we believe that the arguments for a divergence, and Steve's going to talk a little bit more about those on the Israeli side, are something we should really take seriously. I mean, I'll just conclude again with Clinton, who in the same article, and again, this article was titled Unbreakable Bond, but she pointed to these changes and said she was worried about them. Quoting again, because there is a new generation in both countries today that does not remember our shared past. Young Americans who didn't see Israel in a fight for survival again and again. Young Israelis who did not see the U.S. broker at the peace at Camp David or kindle hope at Oslo and stand behind Israel when it was attacked. They are growing up in a different world.
I'll go back to the old world. It's so much more comfortable. In the Reagan administration, when I entered government, there was something called the Cold War, and I can see about half the people in the room probably remember it, at least vaguely. It's difficult to convey at this remove to those who weren't there how tense a historical moment it was. The U.S. was preparing to defend Western Europe against a massive Soviet-led Warsaw Pact assault. The U.S. had 250,000 troops billeted in West Germany alone. There were major U.S. Air Force bases in Italy, Spain, and the U.K., as well as Germany, of course, and a substantial fleet presence in the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Those were the days of the 600-ship Navy. Get tearful. U.S. military planners believed in that period, on the basis of intelligence information, that their Soviet counterparts had developed a campaign plan to seize the oil fields of Khuzestan and Iran and position Soviet forces to cross the Shatt al-Arab, a body of water, at the head of the Gulf into Saudi Arabia and cut off America's Middle Eastern source of oil. In retrospect, this seems like science fiction, with Soviet special operations forces blowing the passes through the Zagros Mountains in northern Iran with atomic demolition mines. But it was a threat that had to be taken seriously. One of the concerns we had then was that the Sixth Fleet would be vulnerable to Soviet air attacks when the war started. The Navy was therefore keenly interested in locations where its fleet assets could bunker and undergo repairs, and where carrier-based aircraft that needed shelter could land if access to a carrier deck was unavailable. Naturally, we looked to Israel as one such bolt hole for the fleet. Commodore Jack Darby, a visionary U.S. naval officer, foresaw a relationship with the IDF that many in the Pentagon and the State Department thought would be too costly. They were wrong, as it happened. Darby persevered. When he died tragically at a young age, Yitzhak Rabin, then Prime Minister of Israel, personally planted a tree in his honor in a very moving ceremony. The U.S. request for Israeli assistance, at the time highly classified, triggered a quiet but fascinating debate among Israelis who were in the know. Some, as was natural, asked whether it was wise for Israel to involve itself willy-nilly in what might be a highly destructive war between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Might it be better for Israel not to expose itself to potentially catastrophic blowback? There was also another different source of skepticism. It was more probing in a way. This faction asked whether predicating the U.S.-Israel relationship on strategic requirements was really the prudent course for the future. After all, they said, strategic interests change. It's inevitable. What happens if Israel seeks to secure its relationship with the United States on that basis, but then one day finds that American strategic interests have shifted? Wouldn't the safer course, they asked, be to continue to ground the U.S.-Israel relationship in shared values, cultural commonality, commitment to democracy, and so forth? They argued that this approach had worked in Israel's favor to that point and had the signal virtue of being immune to shifts in U.S. strategic interests. The debate was resolved ultimately in favor of strategic cooperation, in part because the U.S. offered certain military benefits to Israel that were hard to say no to, and in part because Israel's leadership tended to believe, as perhaps it still does, that America's moral commitment to Israel simply couldn't be trusted. The only reasonably sure way, on this view, to reinforce American commitment was by catering to American self-interest. Sure enough, the Cold War ended, and with it the Soviet threat to the Sixth Fleet and to Saudi Arabia. Initially, the strategic vacuum was filled by a shared concern about Islamic radicalism. Even though the U.S. and Israel didn't really see eye to eye on the nature of the threat, the U.S., after all, was increasingly concerned about al-Qaeda, which didn't interest Israel in the least, and Israel was concerned about Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad, which were not targeting Americans. There was nonetheless at least something strategic sounding to talk about. Moreover, there was a dynamic peace process in play that had both a strategic and moral component. It was a positive, multifaceted agenda. With the collapse of the peace process, though, at the end of the Clinton administration, the outbreak of the second Palestinian uprising thereafter, and then the enormity of 9/11, the counterterrorism agenda naturally retained its pride of place. But things got complicated. Bush, as we know, was committed to freedom and democracy and believed that the U.S. paid a necessary but very high price to keep that commitment. He was, ironically, a liberal interventionist. Now, with the death of Arafat, Bush leaned hard on Ariel Sharon, the Israeli prime minister, to do more to foster the emergence of a Palestinian state. We'll never know how that would have unfolded given Sharon's subsequent incapacitation. But it was pretty clear that for the Bush team, the peace process trumped counterterrorism as the pivot of a U.S.-Israel relationship. It was values versus strategic cooperation, and values came out on top. Looking to the future, after 8 years of tears and flapdoodle, Dana and I asked ourselves the question, was it all about the Bibi Obama psychodrama, or was it something deeper than a clash of personalities burdened by a couple of fleeting and ultimately self-correcting policy disputes? We concluded, on the basis of a fairly detailed look at demographic, social, and political trends in the U.S. and Israel, that the two countries were diverging, and diverging more quickly than we had thought possible. Dana is the expert on U.S., and he's talked about that side on the U.S., and he's talked about that side already. On the Israeli side, suffice it to say, the country is becoming more religious, less enamored of democracy, on the whole, rather less well-educated, and probably less prosperous down the road, given problems in the education sector, the ballooning ultra-Orthodox population, shrinking productivity rates, and a serious brain drain. The growing influence of religion is true even within the IDF, where the ratio of religious graduates of its officer candidate school has rocketed in recent years. The days when the secular kibbutznik dominated the IDF officer corps are probably drawing to a close. Now, we can talk about whether these trends are good, bad, or indifferent. From our perspective, countries evolve over time in response to a lot of factors. Israel's evolution has no doubt been shaped by 100 years of nearly perpetual conflict, the role of the Holocaust in its creation, and the pull of religious identity under these embattled circumstances. And in terms of the protracted nature of the conflict, it can hardly be argued that the perpetuation of the conflict has somehow all been Israel's fault. In any case, as these trends consolidate, the goodwill that has tended to get the U.S. and Israel through strategic disagreements might not well be present in sufficient quantity to surmount such disagreements in the future. It certainly wasn't during the past 8 years. Now, there are close observers of the U.S.-Israel relationship who are very smart and who say, well, these cultural gaps might in fact be widening. But at the end of the day, Israel is still going to be head and shoulders above its neighbors in terms of basic capacity and in terms of their politics. And even if these adverse trends in Israeli society and politics mature, they say, Israel is still going to look a lot better to Americans than, say, Jordan or Egypt, let alone Syria or Yemen. Now, on this view, even if the U.S.-Israel relationship gets more transactional and disputatious, and in cultural terms, the mirror imaging that has sustained the relationship until now cracks, such that we in Israel no longer see ourselves when we look at each other, the U.S. and Israel will still have a close relationship of sorts, especially if the Middle East gets increasingly anarchic, which looks likely. For all the reasons that Dana described a minute ago, this is just not good enough for us, at least for me and Dana, authors of our separate ways. And we don't think the U.S. and Israel need to accept this bleak trajectory either. For us, the historical bonds and liberal roots of the relationship are worth preserving because they make both of our countries better, and they enrich our societies and ways of life. We also think that a renewed, perhaps even reconsecrated relationship, if I can use that term, will help us work together strategically. But renewal will take bold action. Our book offers one option, a treaty alliance that would formalize America's solemn commitment to come to Israel's defense and to help sustain Israel's own military capabilities, and a reciprocal Israeli commitment to withdraw from the West Bank and permit the international community to foster a Palestinian state. If such an arrangement, a grand bargain, for lack of a better term, could be successfully negotiated, it would, at a minimum, keep the U.S. and Israel oriented toward one another. It would align the two countries on a fundamental issue of both values and strategy, and strengthen our ability to preserve our shared interests in a turbulent region. It would also restore Israel's traditional place in American politics as a truly bipartisan concern. Now, Dana and I would be happy to go into detail about this proposal, but we suggest you give up, Buck. But before I close, let me just play devil's advocate, because I do take the alternative perspective seriously. I mean, some will say, for example, that Israel already gets the benefits of the treaty, so why should it pay for what it already gets for free? To these skeptics, I can only say first that if the trends we've described in our book mature, then over time, Israel's access to these benefits might well decline, and the deep bonds we're accustomed to might not be strong enough to sustain American interest in a grand bargain down the road. Second, a consistent theme emerging from Israeli critics of the relationship, especially regarding the Iran deal, is that the U.S. is not, in fact, committed to protecting Israel from Jerusalem's strategic adversary in Tehran. The U.S. commitment has been derided repeatedly in recent years by Israelis, despite explicit U.S. assertions to the contrary. So it looks as though many Israelis do not think that they all are already getting for free what a treaty would require them to pay for. Our hope is that the case we make for a grand bargain that puts the relationship on a renewed foundation of trust and shared values will stir some debate. If it does not, then the likelihood is that we will indeed go our separate ways. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve. Thank you, Dana. It's a great book. I was reading it last night. Let's have a lively Q&A. When you recognize, wait for the microphone, state your name and affiliation as usual. Keep your questions short. Let me just start off, Dana and Steve. The grand bargain that you outline, I can see the pluses, and you're persuasive in your advocacy of it. Which of those parts of the bargain do you think would be more difficult, say, as a political matter? Persuading the U.S. Congress, which doesn't ratify any treaties these days, to accept a new alliance commitment, or persuading the Israeli establishment, which seems hell-bent on expanding its footprint in the West Bank, to withdraw from it?
I think clearly the latter. I'm not, but I think that your point, the way you frame the question indicates that the American commitment to a treaty alliance is not something that should be sneezed at. It is difficult and eased by the fact that there is a general, I think, view and certainly rhetoric that the United States is committed to Israel's security in any event. But to sort of gauge how serious a treaty commitment is, would we be committed to Lithuania's defense right now, about to commit ourselves to Lithuania's defense, if we did not have an Article 5 commitment to it right now? And the answer, I think, is probably no. But we are committed, and we will defend Lithuania. And so I think that gives you something, an indication of its importance. On the Israeli side, it's going to be hugely difficult. Civil conflict scale difficult. Steve may want to talk about that.
I think it depends, on the size of the prize, from an Israeli perspective, and it might be that no prize is grand enough, really to warrant withdrawal from the West Bank. I think it's only negotiation of a treaty along these lines that would reveal what in effect would be Israel's bottom line on that score. I think it's fairly clear from Ehud Barak's revelations about the Israeli cabinet's decision not to approve a strike on Iran, an Israeli unilateral strike on Iran, that even the seriously right-wing side of the Israeli political equation, in that case, Benny Begin, son of Menachem Begin, Yuval Steinitz, and Ya'alon, the former defense minister, all looked at the pros and cons in a fairly coldly, rational way and concluded, that's not going to work. So it's not as though
it wasn't going to work precisely because, in a significant measure, because of jeopardizing the American relationship.
Well, see, the thing is, we don't know what their calculation was because Barak didn't reveal the details, of their argument. But if you put yourself in their shoes, certainly the integrity of the U.S.-Israel relationship and the possibility of a serious backlash from Washington would have been one of the factors they'd consider. There were military factors as well that would have been extremely important because such an operation would have entailed profound risk, as well as among which would have been the capture of Israeli air crews by Iranians, which could have led to an escalation that Israel might have found difficult to manage. So, in talking about the deep changes that are taking place in Israel's politics and society, and within probably the IDF, since it's a citizens' army, and it will ultimately reflect trends that are, more broadly discernible in Israeli society. It does not mean that there's no capacity for calculation. Now, on our side, going back to Congress, well, how juicy can we really make this? One of the things that scholars of alliances will tell you is that successful security arrangements like the ones we're describing generally depend on something that they call a tripwire deterrent. So, for example, the South Koreans believe that we'll defend them because we've still got, 20,000 troops in South Korea, who would bleed if the North attacked. So the United States would be drawn willy-nilly into a conflict in the Korean Peninsula if it were started by the North Koreans. So the question here for Congress, for example, would be, would they approve the deployment of an American force, a permanent deployment of an American force to Israel to function as such a tripwire deterrent, whether as an air defense contingent, or it doesn't have to be anything big, just personnel who'd be at risk in the event of Iranian aggression, let's say. We had considered, and I'll just I can talk about this all day.
Yeah, I've noticed that.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that, in thinking about how grand a bargain you could make, in the book you'll see grander versions of what we've described, and which is another reason, of course, to get the book. But you could make this this arrangement fairly juicy if you felt it was worth it. You could make it pretty hard. I think, for Israelis simply to disregard.
Okay. Well, thank you for a thorough answer to a difficult question. And I'll repeat, if anybody watching live wants to send me a tweet via a notification, I'll monitor them, and if they're reasonable, I'll post them. If they're... So back in the far back there, please.
Thanks. I'm Chris Chivvis. I'm the Associate Director of RAND's International Security and Defense Policy Center. I think it sounds like just a fascinating book, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. If you'll allow me just to push you a little bit more on the policy angle here. If I understand you correctly, it's basically the transaction is basically a defense treaty in exchange for an end to settlements. I mean, that's just in rudimentary terms. That's the bargain that you're proposing. Are there benefits to the United States in the defense treaty in and of itself, or is this purely something that the U.S. would give to Israel?
Yeah. There's an intangible benefit that you may want to address, Dana, in terms of how it would keep two countries with an historic relationship still lashed up with one another. Now, you can say, well, that's nostalgia at work. You know, that's pure sentiment, and there's a very different way of looking at this. And I might have to concede that point, you know, actually. Now, there are tangible benefits as well vis-a-vis U.S. You know, policy objectives, which, as Dana, when he was quoting Hillary Clinton before, you know, illustrates remain fairly constant on the question of an independent, you know, Palestine and resolution of what is at this point, I think strategically, a less important issue for the United States than it has been in the past. It's somewhat surprising to me that that the Democratic candidate made that her opening bid. It shows just how, you know, just how abiding, you know, this interest is, and it's almost always framed in strategic as well as humanitarian, you know, terms, as well as moral terms. But anyway, to the purely strategic, I mean, if you take seriously the idea that the region is going to devolve further in the direction of anarchy or anarchic, you know, conditions, then the United States has an interest in maintaining close ties to whatever states it can maintain close ties to. And the more deeply those ties are embedded in values as well as simply interest, the more useful, presumably, this will be. Now, we don't argue in this connection that suddenly, you know, Israel will be able to deploy forces on our behalf to Saudi Arabia to defend its kingdom, you know, against aggression or something like that. That's, you know, that's an absurd scenario, and no one suggests it. But you know, circumstances change, and just as it was very good for the U.S. to be able to rely on Israel in the Reagan administration for fleet access, such needs might arise in the future. But on the intangibles,
I think first of all, Chris, as you know, the relationship with Israel takes up a huge bandwidth of American policymakers and political. Really?
There you
go. Can you hear me now? No? The relationship with Israel takes up a huge amount of American policymakers and political bandwidth.
He's okay now.
And I mean, there's a sense. My one answer to your question is this commitment that I think we already feel in our body political sort of guts might stand some regularization, if I can put it that way. You know, a treaty alliance would help make things clear and predictable. I mean, we have a long discussion in the last chapter of the book, which I won't reproduce right now, but it effectively says, it compares the alliance, the real alliance we have, although it's not a treaty alliance with Israel, to our Cold War alliances with NATO allies in Europe. And as the Cold War unfolded and then ended, those alliances had a moral component, a values component, and a strategic component, and these reinforced one another. In other words, our successful allies in Western Europe exerted a moral magnetism across the Iron Curtain that was strategically very significant. Now, Israel in its region is not that kind of ally for complicated reasons that I think are fairly obvious. I don't think it's impossible that in the future it could be. I mean, given that Israel obviously has a convergence of strategic interests with countries that don't even want to recognize it, but they have tacit strategic alignment right now. I mean, the Middle East is a much more complicated place, so it's hard to describe the scenario where the values relationship and the strategic relationship reinforce one another in the way that they did with our NATO allies. But it's not impossible if things went well.
Thanks, Dana. Yes, in the front row. Michael, wait for the microphone to come. Second row, I mean.
Mike Macetic, I don't know what kind of time frame you're projecting all this, but I want to bring up a couple of near-term things. You mentioned in one phrase, civil war. To what extent is an Israeli prime minister going to open up the country to a potential civil war, which, as you alluded to, is quite possible if the settlers are asked to, forced to leave their settlements? And on the American side, Bill Clinton detested Netanyahu as much as Obama has. He just hid it better under a smoother personality. Do you see, and the Democratic platform, who knows what that's going to say come July about Israel, the issue of just how much Hillary Clinton is going to be able to do, and even how interested it is. 4 years as Secretary of State, she didn't touch this issue.
Well, she did touch the issue. I mean, she was involved particularly in the earlier arguments about settlements. I said civil conflict, not civil war, but okay. An Israeli prime minister was effectively assassinated over this issue, so there's no question that you're right about that. It's a very, very daunting proposition. I'll just answer. I mean, I think Steve will probably say more about that. But on the American side, in a certain sense, I think I don't want to get too hung up on our policy prescription, which is not the most important part of the book in a sense. I mean, I think more important is the problems we lay out and the history we lay out. But speaking, if we are still talking about the policy prescription, one of the sort of the burden of our analysis is that a Hillary Clinton administration could be the last gas station before it runs out of gas. I mean, I was trying to make this argument that things could happen much more quickly than one would expect. She is very pro-Israeli, but she is very, very committed to a two-state solution. And so you're absolutely right that just as in the Obama administration, there are a lot of problems in the world. There are a lot of problems at home. Israel's just one of them. And it's a little bit much to expect any American president to devote that much political capital to this issue. But that kind of prioritization, although it makes sense and may be inevitable, could be very costly for the relationship, for Israel's future.
Okay, let's go fourth row, gentleman on the left here.
Hi, Ross Johnson. In the book, do you help us understand, the evident lack of U.S. leverage over Israeli actions, particularly in the West Bank? I mean, if I remember correctly, the last suspension of some military deliveries was the Eisenhower administration. Could you address that? And then the other question would be, for the Israeli advocates of a settlement expansion, is there a strategy? Is there an end point? I mean, we used to say about Kosovo, Serbs wanted Kosovo with no Kosovars. What happens to the Arabs in the West Bank if this doesn't stop now and this present situation continues for 10 years?
Steve?
I'll talk about the Israeli side. You can talk about the American side of that. The side of that issue. I don't think many Israelis have a clear idea of an end point. I think many, if asked, would say, well, who knows how it'll work out, but right now there's no deal to be had, so, we're just have to keep things ticking over. There are some advocates of, however, fairly specific plans, some involving unilateral withdrawal. And those plans, differ depending upon the part of the political spectrum that advances them. So to the right, there are notions of unilateral withdrawal that would keep a very large amount of the West Bank in Israeli hands and withdraw from a smaller sort of rump area in which the Palestinians could do what they wanted to do, but they would be still, in effect, contained because in any of these plans, Israel envisages a troop presence along the Jordan River. Probably not much of a bigger one than they have now, which is quite small because the Jordan River is essentially defended on the other side by Jordanians. They have 4 brigades. And then you have, unilateral withdrawal ideas on the left of the spectrum that envisage leaving much more of the West Bank to Palestinians and withdrawing to an area that would look a lot like what Israel would have wound up with on the Clinton parameters, if you can remember that, that far back. So yeah, there are ideas of an endpoint. There are those, of course, at the far right who dream of annexation of the West Bank and so forth. But I suspect that's still, a smallish minority.
Ross, this isn't a reading, but it just so happens that there is a long passage, which I'm not going to read entirely, that outlines the fact that when the White House defines a paramount national interest, U.S. national interest, it gets its way. I mean, the list is very long. From 1950 until the early 60s, the U.S. effectively imposed an arms embargo on Israel. In 56, it forced Israel's withdrawal from the Sinai. In 67, it refused to honor its commitment to keep open the Strait of Tiran. In the early 70s, it forced Israel to cease attacks into Egypt in the so-called War of Attrition. In 1973, it prevented Israel from destroying the Egyptian Third Army. The Reagan administration effectively broke Israel's siege of Beirut and saved the PLO leadership from destruction. Reagan also sold AWACS. You remember that whole argument over the fierce opposition of Israel and the Israel lobby. I've gotten up to the Reagan administration, and it keeps going on, culminating, of course, in the Iran nuclear deal, which was fiercely opposed by Israel. Now, these are all things are all of a different category, of course, than Israeli policy on the West Bank and the issue of the Palestinians. I understand that, and one of the key things about most of the things on that list is they reflected judgments of American national interest, of paramount national interest. Would the fate of, or the future of the Palestinians under Israeli occupation ever rise to that? for that threshold in American policymakers' calculation? It's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer.
Let's go. We got a lot of questions, so let's take two at a time. So the two here in the fourth and fifth rows, short questions, and then we'll take one and then pass it to the other one.
Hi, Alex Tessina, Council on Foreign Relations. I had a question about the grand bargain from the Israeli side and what you envisage. How do you see Israel maintaining its settlement blocks, or is it a total withdrawal? And if you see them maintaining those settlement blocks, who defines the boundaries of those? Does Israel negotiate it with the Palestinians? Do they negotiate it with us, or do they negotiate it within themselves? And if they negotiate it within themselves, what is good enough to be worth our end of the grand bargain?
Okay, good. Nice short question, and then the gentleman in front of you.
Yeah, from Weesel, Jerusalem Report. There are different issues now on the table, the French-European Initiative for a Peace Conference. The question whether Obama will leave office, and before he leaves office, he will make a political statement about the Israeli-Palestinian problem, and the possibility of a Security Council resolution. The question is, would that, in your opinion, have an impact on the tension between values and strategic interest, and in what way could that occur?
You get that?
I think so.
Okay, good. Two questions here.
Yeah, to the first question, thank God, we have a State Department, and they can figure all that out. Basically, you're going to have a treaty negotiation that will, at a minimum, involve the U.S. and Israel, the two parties to the treaty. The United States will do what it has sort of done, but not in a lot of great detail, which is, put down its parameters. This is what the thing has got to look like. And in the course of the negotiation, who knows what will happen? It's a negotiation. My sense is that if this is to work, given the authoritative and, in a sense, decisive nature of the U.S. commitment, there'd have to be a fairly clear-cut commitment from the Israelis in terms of their own obligations that are negotiated, under the treaty. But I think, the outlines, are pretty clear. Based on what Kerry said, when he was working on his 2013 and 2014 initiative, what came out of Clinton, and what the Bush administration expected to achieve at Annapolis. These are fairly well understood parameters. Now, there would have to be some kind of Palestinian input, obviously, but that's why we have a State Department. They'll figure that out. The book is already too long. I don't want to say that, because I don't want to discourage people from reading it. But.
Dana, you want to take the other question? Or do you want to give it?
I said I got it. I'm not sure I got it. It is, of course, after the last elections, I'm not sure this is going to answer the question, but just point out this problem of prioritization. Officials in the Obama administration were obviously pretty angry after the last election, and Netanyahu's statement that Arabs are coming out in droves, and now at this point there was a lot of talk about the U.S. Not only not vetoing a Security Council resolution, but possibly helping to sponsor one. I would only observe that didn't happen, and we're now getting very close to an election. But I don't know what's going to, if U.S. policy on this would change or not. I tend to doubt it.
Okay, last two questions plus one that came in tweet. We got the gentleman here, and the second to the last row there, and then the tweet. Okay, why don't you start with that gentleman, and then you can have the one after that. Okay. Yes, please.
Okay, this gentleman. Tater.
Love these kind of short questions. And then in the front row.
Hi, I'm Jesse Arm. I'm a student at the University of Michigan, and I work in Senator Cotton's office. So my question for you is, I have a lot of questions about the policies in the book, but I'm going to buy the book, so I won't bore you with those. My question is, do you have a reaction to the reports that came out in the past week about Isaac Herzog making comments about that he did meet with Abbas in preliminarily before the recent elections, and the fact that he agreed to a right of return for Palestinians, as well as a possible return to 1967 borders. My question is the prospect of a deal like that happening in the future, as well as what it would mean for the U.S.-Israel strategic and political alliance.
Thanks very much. And then the question that came in via Twitter, if Israel and the United States do go their separate ways, will Israel look elsewhere for a protector, a large power? Might Russia, in some sense, replace the United States? Could Russia give protection against Iran to Israel?
Those are all 3 years, but I could take the last one if you want.
David, you asked about Jordan?
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't see Jordan being directly involved in a treaty negotiation between, two other countries, but Jordan's interests would certainly be taken into account. And there's one variant of the unilateral withdrawal plans very much looks like the Jordan option of old, which is to say that it works if you have a confederation of an independent Palestinian West Bank and Jordan. I'd say, to me this makes a lot of sense, but the devil, as usual, is in the details, not least of which would be, the Hashemite kingdom's view of a confederation, with a large number of Palestinians from the West Bank. But anyway, pardon?
Herzog.
Oh yeah, I'm not familiar with the incident with Herzog. I do know that after his latest failed bid to join the government as a coalition member, the Israeli press delighted in invoking an old Hebrew saying, which is, he ate the stinking fish, he was chased from the city and beaten. No, he was beaten and chased from the city. So, which is to say that, his political position was precarious and it had gotten worse. So I don't know that, he's a really big player. And one of the things that we talk about in the book is the prospects, for the left in Israeli politics, which we think are really rather bleak. So, I think following Herzog is it's an interesting thing to do, but, you might have other things to do on your weekends that would be more, rewarding. And on the larger question that you asked, that's what the book is really all about. I mean, you asked a very fundamental question.
On the question of Israel looking elsewhere for partners or even allies, we discuss this a lot in the book because there is a lot of discussion of it in Israel. It did not go unnoticed that Israel's ambassador to the United Nations was absent when our ambassador was rounding up votes to condemn the annexation of Crimea. And, Israel, of course, is an independent country, and it should have good relations with lots of countries. But when I've talked to Israelis about this, they say there is interest in relations with Russia. I mean, it's long-standing relations with China. Other countries are mentioned. There is, of course, the fact that in most recent years, there's been a kind of strategic alignment of Israel and Saudi Arabia. both of which were quite impatient and exasperated with the seeming strategic preferences of the United States vis-a-vis Syria. Well, Israel's more complicated than that, but certainly vis-a-vis Iran and the nuclear deal. My sense is that most of the Israelis I talk to always come back down to the conclusion that this would be a bad trade if you were really looking at it at other relationships as substitutes for the alliance with the United States.
Well, I think that's a fair conclusion. And on that, we'll call it to a close because we said we'd be 1 hour. I want to keep to that promise. Please join me in thanking Dana Allen and Steve Simon for a fantastic presentation.